welcome back. Today we're going to start a new series on how to utilize the Rhino Mocks isolation framework. In this series we're going to attempt to cover all the various basic scenarios which an isolation framework can be utilized. In this episode we're going to start small. We're going to start off by learning how to stub out data and how to fake out return values. I picked this as a starting point because when learning to utilize an isolation framework, this is generally the most common use case, and in the future episodes we'll dive deeper and take looks at other usages of the isolation framework. So I'm on the Rhino Mocks homepage. Rhino Mocks is a open source isolation framework that is maintained by Allende, also known as Oranini. You can go out to allende.com/project-rhinomocks to get to the product page to actually download it. For the 3.5 version, which is the most recent release of Rhino Mocks, he also has a nice wiki up here that will explain in detail all the various different usages of the tool as well. And we'll cover things that I won't necessarily go into in this cast as well as other casts. So the first thing we need to do is we need to understand a couple basic terms, and they are a mock and a stub. Within the Rhino Mocks framework, these two terms are used in particular when you want to set up and create an instance of an object under isolation. And when you talk about a mock, you're talking about an object where you want to set an expectation on it and then verify those expectations are met. When you talk about a stub, we're talking about setting up an object so that you can, maybe provide default behavior and pass that object around into your test. It can be utilized by the code under test, but you are not necessarily going to verify the expectations. So now that we understand some, the basic difference between a mock and a stub, and we understand what we're going to do today, let's go ahead and get started and take a look at some of the code and figure out how we're going to do this. So in today's example, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some very simple code here, and this is code that will email login information if you've forgotten your username or password for a website. And it's already set up, and I basically have a couple calls here. I'm going to call off to our repository and fetch information for the user. I'm going to call off to the repository and grab the challenge information. This is the, hey, what college did you go to? What's your mother's maiden name? Your favorite color is blue. That type of information. And then I'm going to set up an expectation, a call to validate that user information. And then if all goes well, we're going to send an email. Now, what we'd like to do today is test that if all pathways are met, that no exceptions are thrown, and that we get an email that was sent to us. In this one, because we're going to start off small, we're going to start off and basically learn basic terminology and usage scenarios within Rhino Mocks. Now, the Rhino Mocks isolation framework is one of the frameworks that utilize the AAA syntax. And AAA stands for Arrange, Act, Assert. And what this does, it allows you to set up your test in a very natural flow. So you're going to set up all your expectations, or you arrange all your pre-work. You're going to act on it. Acting typically is just making a call into the class or to the object to do something. And then you're going to assert that various expectations were met. Now here we are not going to actually do any asserts today. And the reason for this is, again, we want to keep it small, we want to keep it short. We only have about 10 minutes. So what is it we want to do? Well, we want to create a test that will, verify an email sent. I'm going to go ahead and copy in our comments here. Now, what I like to do when I set up my unit tests is I like to first create an instance of the object that I plan to test. So let's go ahead and do this. We're going to be calling and testing our user login service. And as you can see, that takes 3 dependencies: a user repository, challenge validator, and email gateway. And we have our user login service. The next thing I like to do is actually fulfill my, contract here for my object. So let's go ahead and create a local variable for user repository. Now, because I'm using an isolation framework, I can't just create a variable because it won't work. I won't be able to provided default behavior. So this is where we're going to introduce the mocking framework. Rhino Mocks has a static class called mock repository, and mock repository has two methods, generate mock and generate stub. We talked about the difference between a mock and a stub a few minutes ago. In our scenario, because we're not actually going to verify expectations, we're going to generate a stub. And this takes a generic, so I can say user repository. And I'm going to go mock repository, generate stub. And I'm now set up and met all my expectations. So I can now compile. Now the next thing I want to actually do is call user login service and email login information. And as you can see, email login information takes two values. So let's do we'll call this Fred. Now I'm going to create two local variables. For this, and then we'll do this one. We don't really care about the challenge response. At this point in time, I should have a compiling test that won't do anything because it'll actually fail because nothing happens. So let's actually see how this actually works, because we've not set up any expectations at this point. So I get here, and the one thing I want to point out real quick is if I hover over a mock instance, you'll notice that it says I use repository proxy and then a GUID. The reason for that is when you actually generate a mock instance, it's using the Castle Project dynamic proxy to create a proxy wrapper around it. That's how it can intercept the calls. And at this point in time, if I step into my logic here and hit F11, you'll notice it will not actually go into the fetch user information class, but it will return a null. In our scenario, null is not what we want because, as you can see, it's going to throw an exception and fail our test. So what we need to do now is set up our various expectations for our test. So let's go ahead and do that now. And that's still in our range segment, by the way. So we're about to learn some new syntax here for Rhino Mocks. When you want to set up an expectation, there are some extension methods that are part of the Rhino Mocks framework that will let you do that. And one we want to use today is stub. Stub is what we're going to use to predefine our expectations. And stub uses lambda syntax. So I say, fetch user information. And I can use, let's go ahead and use username here. And we're going to say this returns a new user. And because I've defined username down here, let's go ahead and copy that up to the top here so I can actually use it both times. And so what I've done here is I've said, let's stub this out, and here's a method that's going to be stub, and it's just going to always return a new instance of a user. Now to save ourselves a few seconds, I'm actually going to copy and paste in something real quick. Now what I've pasted in here is a couple more stubs. Get challenge response information, and you'll see I'm using this different syntax right here. Rhino Mocks has the ability to have you pass in a valid object, or you can basically say, you know what, I'm going to use any user object. I really don't care what it is. And that's what this syntax does. It says if a user is of type user, and it's anything, let it pass. So I'm setting expectation on get challenge response info, and it will return the valid information from the database. I'm also doing the same thing on our validator, saying that when you call into it, it's going to pass true. Now if we run this now, let's see what happens. So now when I come over, it's actually going to give me an instance of the user, which is good, because that lets me pass that part of the logic. Let's step over the challenge response info, and it gives me my valid challenge response. And now I should be able to step right over this because I've told it to return true. But wait a minute, I told it to return true, yet it's going into the exception block. Why is that? Well, the reason is I told the stub to expect the challenge from database and the provided challenge to be pushed into the call. However, the real challenge response that's pushed in is this one down here. What Rhino Mocks is smart enough to say that, hey, if you tell me that you're passing this instance of an object, if you don't give it to me during the test run, I'm not going to succeed. So the way we can get around that is pass in the same instance. Let's try that again. And if I step into this, let's go ahead and put our breakpoint here, skip over some stuff we've already verified once before. Now, if I hit F10 again, I do skip and don't give my exception, because again, the database challenge response and the challenge response that's being used are the ones I use in my stub. And then email gateway, some stubs, so it's not going to actually do anything. And my test technically will pass. Now in this particular test we did not do any assertions or verification of calls. We'll get to that kind of syntax in future episodes. But what I want to point out again today is what we looked at, which is how to generate a stub. We looked at the differences between a stub and a mock. We looked at how to set up a stub, how to return values. We looked at the difference between providing a single instance of an object or a string, or telling the framework to use anything that gets passed in. And we took a look at how if you do specify the exact object you want to use in your test, if you don't use that, your test will actually. So I hope you learned something today, and in future episodes we're going to take a deeper dive into how to utilize the Rhino Mocks isolation framework. Till next time.